You may wonder why three particular lessons are centered around David Lipscomb. In reading this book, to me it appears that the author believes, and I'm sure that it is true, that David Lipscomb had a tremendous amount of influence upon the church in the latter part of the 18th century. Part of that was because of his preaching, but more of that, I think, was because of his the gospel advocate that was sent out. This reached a lot of people, and a lot of people, there was always a question and answer section in it, and people were asking questions, and he was answering them. And if you've read your lesson very carefully, you'll find that Lipscomb was a highly opinionated individual. And there's some things that you and I might not necessarily agree with him. There were a number of things that I didn't really know about him because most of his biographers don't touch on some of these things. But it is interesting to find out the leaders of times past and the kind of influence that they have had upon us and how it's gotten to us this very day. We'll have one more lesson next week that will still continue a good bit of what Lipscomb thought. And I have some interesting comments for you on the one when we start talking about the elders and his position on this. This opens with a statement that he made in 1869. You have to remember now, this is only about 4 years after the Civil War. The South has been devastated. There is very little economy that is here other than still maybe some cotton, maybe corn, personal farming, small farms. And but as far as industry, there's very little that was left in the South. And here's a statement that he comes out with. He says, "The poor of this world were the chosen vessels of mercy, the especially honored and blessed of God. They, as a class, constitute His elect." Now, you can make anything out of that you'd really like to. Lipscomb's position on this simply was that he felt like that this was the realm of life that needed to be reached the most, and also because of their lack of privilege, lack of money, lack of advance, lack of education, that here were people that would respond to the call of the gospel as much, if not more so, than those that were in a better financial and social status. In June of 1873, a deadly cholera epidemic struck Nashville, Tennessee. And on Black Friday, June the 20th, at least 72 people died on that particular day. The epidemic raged for the whole month of June, and there was more than 1,000 people that died from cholera. And it was about 1 out of every 40 residents died. That would mean probably on your block, at least one of your neighbors would have passed away. Nashville was still not a huge city at this particular time, not like it is today. It had begun basically as sort of a river town, very much like Knoxville did, but became very prominent as time went on because of the rivers that converged in that general area. Here is a map that was issued in 1873 about the cholera epidemic. The red portions on this show the areas of concentration where the disease struck the hardest. The darker the area, the more people that there were. And one thing I want to point out on this to you, cholera is a waterborne disease. And if you don't have good water, that is something that will really affect you. I don't know if this is sharp enough for you to see, but here is one of the major creeks that runs through Nashville, and you can see on both sides of that creek the concentration of people that came down with cholera. Here is another major creek that runs down through Nashville into the Tennessee River. And even on the far side over here, here is another creek here that runs in, and on both sides of that are some concentrations where there were people. And then up here in this area, also a major tributary that fed into the Tennessee River. And these were the concentrated areas where the disease of cholera was found. Cholera was linked to dirty water by the 1800s, and public health message was clean it up. You have to remember that this is still the time before running water in houses. Well, a lot of them did have running water. Grab a bucket and run down to the well and get your well and get well water and bring it back to the house, and hopefully that your well wasn't contaminated. The barn areas, the housing areas, sewage, and the picture on your right-hand side of the fellow with the barrel, I don't know if you can read the caption underneath it. It says, feeding cows, and there's a cow in that shed that is there, from the slaughterhouse refuse. Well, you can imagine how things would have gone when all of that nasty stuff was being taken care of in that way. Of course, to them, that was recycling, but it was still something that helped feed the cholera epidemic. There were a lot of folks that just simply panicked when this cholera epidemic struck. And those that were financially able, which included a lot of Christian folks, they fled the city by train to escape this cholera epidemic. Don't know why they thought that would get them away from it, but it's sort of like today, if there is a wreck or a fire, we run to it to see what's going on instead of running away from it. And if you have a fire in your house, the best thing to do is get out and get away from it. These people thought that this was the best way that they could handle it. If they weren't sick and nobody in their family was sick and they had the means to buy a train ticket, then they would hop on the train and go to wherever the train would take them to get away from this until the epidemic had died down. Yes?
This is just an interesting sidelight to me, but my great-great-grandfather was in Nashville at the time, and I have a copy. I have the letter, the original letter, that he wrote to his son-in-law about the cholera epidemic in Nashville at that time.
Okay. All right. I hope it's been dipped in alcohol. I don't know how long the disease could be carried on, but more likely than not, it would not be carried by a piece of paper anyway. During this time, at least 200 black people died in the New Bethel community in the southern part of Nashville, Tennessee. Here's a picture showing a child that has cholera, and it was not a very nice type of disease. This was one that was just a very nasty thing for folks to have. People that had resources sometimes chose to leave the city, and others stayed and worked among the sick and the dying. And a lot of these people that stayed and helped those that were sick included doctors, preachers, dressed a little different than we used to, didn't we? And also a lot of the nuns that were there in Nashville. St. Thomas Hospital, for any of you who have been there, was a Catholic hospital and has been there for many years. And even though Lipscomb was not of the strongest of health himself. He did stay and work with the poor and the sick, risking his own life. He helped distribute food. He helped give supplies. He went to the homes of blacks and the poor and helped clean and feed them. And here's his picture again we've used. And I think this is a picture that was also in our book. I was able to pick this up and to use it for an illustration. This is from the Republican banner, which I suspect later on became the Nashville banner, which I don't think it's in existence any longer. But it simply lists the cholera victims on Sunday and Monday, and particularly on those 2 days that are there. Lipscomb spent some considerable time using his buggy, and part of that was to carry these nuns from place to place wherever they were needed, and he had a great respect for them. He made the statement, he said, every individual, white or black, that dies from neglect and want of proper food and nursing is a reproach to the professors of the Christian religion in the vicinity of Nashville. Now, when he talks about professors of religion, he's not talking about school teachers. He's not talking about college professors. He's talking about those who profess the fact that they are a Christian. And he had a conflict with people simply because he felt like many of them should have stayed and helped and did not, and should have done what they could have, and some did not do that. And he based that upon the idea that Christians were people who had taken a very solemn pledge, and that pledge included this concept. We solemnly have made in our profession of faith in Christ and of our baptism into Him is that we strive to reproduce His life before the world in our own lives. What's one of the outstanding things that you remember about the ministry of Jesus? Did what? He healed the sick. The scriptures indicate him as a person who went about doing good. And again and again we find the miracles that were involved with Jesus had to deal with some kind of malady that individuals had. And this was the business that he was in. He was not a physician, but he was the Son of God. He had the ability to be able to perform miracles and to heal those folks that had different kinds of maladies. In a series that I teach about Jesus and the miracles, we kind of classify the miracles of how they come about, whether it's demon possession or whether it's some kind of physical malady or maybe even a mental problem or some kind that people had. And there's some others also that classifications of the different kinds of miracles that he does. He asked the question, and this was from his preaching standpoint, that oftentimes he would say, how would Christ have responded to this epidemic and the wild panic that seized so many people? Don't know of anything in modern times that really would stack up against the way that people reacted to the cholera epidemic in 1873 in Nashville. The closest thing that I would think of in some of our lifetimes has been the polio epidemics that we had, which is basically eradicated, which is really nice. There are other types of diseases that go around from time to time, and I think right now Memphis is having a problem with measles. When we do not get vaccinated against some of these common diseases that we can catch, then there becomes an outbreak, and lots of folks get sick as a result of them. He also asked the question, he said, if Jesus had been a resident of Nashville and he had $10, $20, or $100, what would he have done? The only time that I ever remember in the scriptures that Jesus was associated with money are two occasions. One was when he cleansed the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers that was there. And the other time was when he sent Peter out to catch a fish that would have a coin in his mouth for him to go and pay Peter's taxes and his taxes. There seems to be nothing else that reflects that Jesus either handled money or had any kind of money of any sort of kind. What would Jesus have rushed off to some place of refuge and left the poor to suffer? You never find Jesus rejecting folks when they come to him. I've always been amazed by one of the miracles where Jesus is going through a great crowd, and the woman with the issue of blood sneaks up behind him and touches his garment. And he knows that. It's in some way he understands that, as the scripture says, virtue's gone out of him. In other words, there is something that has transpired by her doing this because of her particular faith. And so he heals her as a result. Lipscomb says that Christ probably or would have stayed in the city and used all of his means to relieve the suffering. Now, these are ideas and things that Lipscomb taught and preached, and were things that not only in a local sense when he was preaching, but also would be things and articles that you would find in the Gospel Advocate itself. The cholera epidemic revealed what would be called the fundamental nature of the Christian faith as Lipscomb understood it. Now, you have to also remember that this is only a couple of steps away from Campbell and McGarvey and some of the other Stone and Raccoon John Smith and other individuals of the Restoration movement. And thinking had not gelled to the point as I think it has today. I think most of us would say, well, we're pretty well set in what we believe and what we think, and we probably are. I told Levi the other day when we were talking, I said, teaching an adult class is a whole lot different than teaching youth. You can ask a question in a youth class, if there's 12 kids in there, 11 hands will go up, and eventually the 12th hand will go up because all the other hands are up. And you might ask that child, well, what's your answer? And that child will say, and they just raised their hand instead of having an answer. And I said, when you got an adult class, you have to have a crowbar to get an answer or at least another question out of adults. For some reason, they just don't like to talk in a Bible class. But whatever it is, there are some things that Lipscomb had settled upon, and these were the foundations of what he thought true Christianity was. He said it was inextricably wrapped up with regard for the poor. This was probably a central point of his preaching and his teaching. It doesn't help that Lipscomb himself was not a rich individual. He was basically just a farm guy, and the 60 acres that he owned at that time has become the Lipscomb University that it is today. And if Lipscomb could walk upon those 60 acres today, he wouldn't recognize a square foot of it. It has changed so considerably over the years. His writing for nearly 50 years proclaimed his deep conviction that ministry to the poor serves as a fundamental identifying mark of the true church. I think maybe that he might be right to a great degree on that particular point. I wonder how often that we still reach out to what we would call the lesser classes today. Those, I'd say that generally throughout our congregation here, we'd be at least middle class to upper middle class, maybe even some a little further than that. But as far as having some really real poor folks, except for a few instances here in just the last few months, where are they? Now, we do service an awful lot of people through our clothing closet and also through our food program that we have. But even most of those individuals are not what you and I would class as really poor folks, especially when they drive up in Cadillacs and SUVs, and every one of them's got a smartphone, and all of them seem to be reasonably well dressed. And occasionally somebody comes through that really, I would say, represents pretty much the poorer class of folks in here. Their clothes are tattered and their hygiene is not real good. But most of the folks that we do serve are elderly folks and single person families. 2 weeks ago, as I made a count of the families and the people we have, during the 2 hours that we served food to individuals, there were only 13 children that were involved in all of those families that came through, and there were 70 families that came through. So we're not servicing a lot of families that have small children. Now, we have about 5 or 6 large families that have anywhere from 8 or 9 people that are in them, but not all of them are small children. Some of them are mostly teenagers, and some of them in which there's probably sons and daughters and husbands and wives of them that have come back home and are staying with mom and dad. So we do what we can do for these folks. When they show up, we try to help them the best that we can. In Matthew 11 and verse 4, and this is not in your book, this is probably one of the passages that Lipscomb would have used again and again. Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and show John." Now, this is when John's disciples had come to Jesus. John was in prison, and he sends his disciples to Jesus and asks a question: "Are you the one? Are you the one we're looking for?" Now, of all people, I would have thought that maybe John would have had a little more insight. I mean, he was a cousin of Jesus to start with. Secondly, he was the forerunner for Christ. He had baptized Jesus, and you would have thought that here was a man who really knew about Jesus. But don't you find that occasionally your faith falters also? It may be some tremendous event that takes place, or maybe a child dies, maybe there's a terrible accident that happens, or or something that affects your life very much. And you begin to wonder, is God doing this for me, or is God doing this to me? When oftentimes God has just allowed it. He hasn't been personally responsible to it. He said, "Go and show John again the things which you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me." Here is a theme in the preaching of Jesus, in the continuation of what John was doing. And all of this had to deal with reaching out to the people of that day and time. Now, I'm of the opinion that people were a whole lot poorer in that day and time than they are today. Now, one thing that impressed me years ago when I preached in the state of Georgia were a lot of the shacks that we found people living in. But outside those shacks was a decent looking automobile, and inside was sometimes a color television, which I couldn't afford. Well, I did have one. I had a black and white one. That's 2 colors. But the whole idea that here was a generation of people, here was a whole nation of people on which there were more people that were what we would say dirt farmers than there were anything else. Almost everybody raised food to eat. It was not like being able to go to Kroger's or to any of the other Whole Foods places or Sam's Club or any place like this and buy food to take home in bulk form sometime. These people would have markets that they could go to. And generally what they would do is whichever, and usually the male of the family would go to work, and his wages for that day would be enough for the wife the next morning to go out to the market and to buy what was necessary to feed his family that day. If you didn't work, you didn't eat the next day. And I don't find the situation in America today quite in that dire predicament. The people of the day and time in which Lipscomb lived were still under the effects of the Civil War, and nothing had really progressed very much, and they were just kind of wandering around. Things were changing, but not always for the best part for those which we would call the working poor. In Matthew 26:11, he says, "For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Times in different congregations, different situations, they've cut out their clothing closets and they've cut out their food pantries because it's been so expensive. But in times there have been many people in the community that have suffered as a result. I really thought back in the 1st of March when we changed the designation in our food program, instead of allowing everybody to come every 2 weeks, we set the limitation you can come once a month. Have not had one complaint about it. Not one complaint. Nobody says, I'll starve to death. No. Basically, what food that we hand out should feed 2 people for about 2 weeks. At that time, is what we were feeding them would have been enough for them to exist on, not to be feed sumptuously, but to exist upon for about a month. And I know there were a few people who were coming through that really, really needed that. But when we explained to them the situation, there were no complaints. And in fact, for 3 weeks, nobody came back a second time in the month, except one guy that wasn't paying a bit of attention, and he never pays any attention anyway. Those of you that know Michael understand. In Luke, the 4th chapter and verse 18, here's another passage. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, to the recovering of sight to the blind, and set at liberty those that are bruised, and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord."
This is that the poor are often more receptive to the message than the rich.
Okay.
Because the rich have plenty and the poor really have almost nothing.
Okay. This, I think, is part of the basic message that Lipscomb had. And sometimes in the current day and time, we have catered more to the rich and sumptuous. If you go to some church buildings, and we'll address this a little bit later in the lesson, Lipscomb points this out. There are huge and magnanimous church buildings that have been built in lots of places, much more ornate than what we have here. And sometimes, and as we'll point this out a little bit later on, it caused a problem in the church. In the 1870s and 1880s, now this is only 5 to 15 years past the Civil War, this became the age of big business. robber barons, exploding industrialism, and powerful railroad companies. How many of you ever heard the term carpetbagger? Do you know what that referred to? What? Use the crowbar here now. What was a carpetbagger?
I thought it was somebody from the north who came down and took advantage of the poor people in the south.
Not only the poor people, but also anybody that had a little bit of money of any kind. And that's basically what they were, and that's how they were noted. They had these bags that were made out of what you and I would call carpet in this day and time, and that was what they operated out of. Sometimes we'd call them traveling salesmen, but these people were in the business. They would go to somebody that was about to starve to death, offer them cents on the dollar for the property that they were on, and buy their property and buy up land in great amounts for the purpose of making money off of it at a later time. These are names that you probably are familiar with: Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Pierpont Morgan, and then something that you may not have been familiar with, and this is a terminology called the gospel of wealth. I think this has raised its ugly head again in our 21st century. If you watch a lot of the TV evangelists, their central point is, you send me some money and you'll get blessed, and the more money you send me, the richer you'll get out of all of this. And I'll be back next week after I go buy my new Learjet. It is the gospel of prosperity instead of the gospel of wealth. The more you give, the more you get. And this is a theme that crops up and comes around again and again. It was an age when some ministers assured their flocks that godliness is in league with riches. When you become a Christian, all things will be good for you. Everything will be great for you. You will become wealthy because God wants you to have wealth. He wants you to do well in the kingdom of God. Kind of interesting to note that in the latter 1800s, from somewhere about 1870 and on, in only less than 30 years, there were labor strikes that broke out in record numbers. As a matter of fact, our writer extends the number of saying there were some 35,000 labor strikes by the end of the 1800s. I didn't know there was that much organization that took place. When you got a group of guys together and they started comparing what they were making and what the owners were making versus what they were making, they became unsettled and were not very happy about it. During all of this time, it was an age when people were still affected by devastation and poverty in the South. And this was a typical home for someone who did not live in a city. It was a tough time. And it was a very difficult time. And these were homes, some of you, your grandparents, maybe even your parents lived in a house that was this kind of house that you could sit over and you could watch the dog, chicken walk around the house. Usually there was no underpinning on this one. Sometimes they were raised up higher than this one was. And sometimes that was because you stored things in the house to keep it out of the rain. Lipscomb lived in a time in which many families he visited. He said, we felt that every mouthful of food we ate was taken from women and children who must suffer for it. And we've not lived in that kind of poverty. Now, those of you that may have gotten a taste of the end of the Great Depression. There may be one or two of you, not many in this room. You got a taste of the end of the Great Depression. Do you remember what it was that pulled us out of the Great Depression? World War I. And And then after World War I was over, there was another depression, not as great as the Great Depression. And what pulled us out of that was World War II. And the industry in America spun at a frightening rate. There was more production of everything except food. And everybody had a victory garden. If you're not aware of why in most communities, in many communities, everything shuts down at noon on Wednesday, that comes from World War I, when everybody was sent home to work in their victory garden and to raise food. Probably none of you have ever been through a metal collection. We call it recycling today, in which people would go from house to house and collecting pots and pans and anything else made out of metal for the war, for service in the war. What took place at this time was the residual result of the Civil War that was called the general desolation in the South. And even until after World War II, there had not been a tremendous recovery of the economies in the South itself. Lipscomb's fundamental conviction about the church was this: the church is the special legacy of God to the poor of the earth. To him, to reach to these people because they had little hope. They had little anything to be self-sufficient. These were the people that would have a greater reliance upon God and trust in God. Even on our money today, we say, in God we trust. And even many of the liberals today want that off of there because they don't believe in God. Well, I'm not going to get on that stump tonight. The poor were the chosen vessels through which God most often had chosen to work, either to work in the kingdom or for the kingdom to work with these individuals. He reminds people that even the Old Testament prophets were poor and they often lived in sackcloth. I'm not so sure that Jonah was poor. He was able to book passage on a boat to get away from Nineveh. Of course, he had to leave Nineveh and go to the seacoast before he could get a ship. But there are others that had very little. If you've ever read the book of Jeremiah, which I hope you have, you find one of the interesting things about Jeremiah is he walked up and down the streets naked preaching. Now, I haven't gotten to that point yet, and you're probably very thankful for that. He also pointed out that Jesus was born into a poor family and lived among the laboring, toiling classes throughout his youth. It would have been the custom that Jesus, being the eldest child, was certainly trained by Joseph in the carpentry business. By trade, Jesus would have been noted as a carpenter. He was noted as the carpenter's son. But we don't know of anything that Jesus ever assembled or put together other than bringing people together to serve God. The point he made it also was that Jesus mingled with, Jesus during his ministry lived as a homeless wanderer on the earth. He had no place to lay his head that was his own. And that he mingled with the poor in their homes. He ate of their coarse barley loaves and shared of their frugal fare. I won't think I'll go there. One of the interesting things is oftentimes when he came to Jerusalem, he stayed with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And I'm not so sure that these were actual real poor people, but these were people who were very interested in Jesus and were always ready to take care of him and entertain him. Even when Lazarus had died, the sisters were ready to offer hospitality to Jesus and the men that were with him at that time too. In Luke 9:58, Jesus said to this is the young man that had come to him and wanted to know what he needed to do, and he was telling him, he said, you need to go and sell everything you have and come and follow me. He said, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Nothing that was his, nothing that he owned. And even at the time that he died, the most precious possession that he had evidently was the coat that he was wearing. And it was so special that even they did not want to tear it in two, the centurions, the soldiers that were there at the cross. Even when Jesus chose his apostles, he chose them from the working class, the fishermen, the tax collectors, the laboring individuals. There's some of the apostles we don't know much about, but we know Peter, Andrew, James, and John were all fishermen, and that Matthew was tax collector, and that's 5 out of 12 that we know of, and the other occupations we're not sure of. Only speculation. Lipscomb concluded, or came to the conclusion, that the poor of this world were the chosen vessels of mercy, the especially honored and blessed of God, and they as a class constitute his elect. I think one of the hardest things to deal with as far as spirituality is a person who says they have pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. This is a person who believes that they have arrived because of what they have done, not necessarily because God has blessed them or that God has looked favorably upon them or that the events that have happened to them in life are sometimes like the events that happened to Job, a learning situation, a learning session. And sometimes the poor don't have those opportunities. Lipscomb often repeated that the great mass of his true and honored followers in all ages of the world have been, ever must be, from the poor.
To seek out highly educated people, especially to proclaim the gospel. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus did not go to the universities and ask for PhDs to come and work with him. He got the people that were actually working.
Part of the early philosophy of the churches here in Oak Ridge was that we need highly educated ministers because we're going to be trying to reach highly educated people that work at the plants. I'm not so sure that philosophy worked too very good, because many of the great scientists that were both here and also at Los Alamos were not of the Christian faith. Many and most of those were Jews and came from the Jewish background. And they had fled Europe for the idea of getting away from what was going to happen in the beginning of World War II. So oftentimes we haven't been able to reach these folks like we had thought. And we have perhaps neglected reaching the common working class of folks in the community. In Luke 14 and verse 12, Jesus had been invited to a meal, and he said to the one that had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you'd be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Over the years, in trying to help younger preachers, part of the advice that I have given them is that sometimes people want to give you things because you're the preacher. Sometimes that's because your salary has been so low that you're having a hard time living. But they want to do something for you. And I always remember a good brother at Park City, very elderly man. And every Easter and every 4th of July, knocked on my door and brought me a shoulder off of a hog that had been cooked all night long for hours and hours. He just wanted to do something for the preacher. And boy, you talk about being thankful when you've got people that think about you like this and they want to do something for you. And sometimes, as I've told these young preachers, they'll bring you something that you don't need or you don't want, but you be gracious and you take it because they are trying to do the best that they can and they want to benefit you in some way. So I think that maybe this is sort of the concept that Jesus was talking about in this passage. In the book of James, James writes and he says, "Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those that love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppresses you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you?" Well, I'm sure that as we look at some of these things that Lipscomb thought about, that this is another one of those statements that sometimes that we may take one way or the other. He thought that the poor generally make the best members when they're converted, because without worldly wealth and greatness to engross his care and to hold his affections, such a person is more readily learns to depend on God and submit to the divine will. This is what you were saying a while ago. Why is that? When somebody is really down and out, there's a time to listen. Any of you ever sell insurance? Any of you? What's one of the first things that they tell you when you go to sell insurance? You go look for somebody that's had a baby, that's had a death in the family, that's had some kind of turmoil because they're going to be ready to try to fix something that may happen again in the future, which probably won't, unless having babies would not fit into that. But Lipscomb said such people, the poor, are better able to maintain the spirit of self-denial and resist the temptation to compromise with the world. He believed, and now we kind of change direction just a little bit as we kind of wind up our lesson, that wealth generally corrupted the church. I'm not so sure that that really happens. It has in some places. It can when you don't have good leadership and you don't have the right person in the pulpit, because the teaching needs to be to the point where folks can understand where they are and what they need to do. He said the rich, and even worse, those not rich who aspire to ape and court the rich, are the greatest corrupters of the church. And he said that this happens because worldly possessions, honors, and responsibilities above a modest competence steal the time, wean the affections, and hinder service to God. The biggest problem with those from 25 to about 45 is they're busy making a living. And sometimes they're too busy for anything else. Sometimes they're too busy for their wives, sometimes they're too busy for their children, and certainly for many times they're too busy for the church. And I think this was the concept that he was thinking about, because you have to remember that back in the days in which he preached, I don't think there was that many rich folks around, not as richly endowed as people seem to be today. He said when the rich embrace faith, he said 90 times out of every 100 their influence is to corrupt the church, lower the standard of morality, and relax all discipline in a congregation or in a church. He also stood on the idea that wealth so changes things that they, the poor, cannot conform to its customs and they do not feel at home, and that oftentimes they feel like they don't have the right kind of clothes, they don't fit in, they look around and they find opulence that kind of keeps them away from the kingdom of God. And then Lipscomb deplored the pouring of money into church buildings. Oh, this raises its ugly head every once in a while. And he said, when I hear of a church setting out to build a fine house, I give that church up. Its usefulness as a church of Christ is at an end. And you can kind of understand. Here's a beautiful church building, and look at the stained glass windows that are in this. We've got stained glass. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but it's stained so you can't see in or out. It's called foggy. But the whole idea is, I think it keeps down distractions, both from the inside and on the outside. I got distracted a while ago. One of the classes had their kids out here in the front, and they were looking in the door, seeing what we were doing in here. But in many larger church buildings, and these big windows, big round windows like this, does anybody know what those were called? They were called Catherine wheels, because Catherine the Great is the one who started this kind of decoration as far as church buildings were concerned in Russia. Well, I have to show you something. This is the Granny White Church of Christ that sits on Granny White Boulevard next to the Lipscomb campus. I'm sure that if Mr. Lipscomb were alive today, he would not be happy that this big, beautiful edifice was there. And it's a fairly wealthy congregation, and they can afford it, and they have done a lot of good and a lot of work over the years. But it's kind of interesting to notice, too, this building. Does anybody in here other than my wife recognize what this building is? Robert, you ought to recognize this. It's old Avalon Hall, where they had Miss Irma Lee Beatty had all the song leaders over there to teach kids how to lead singing or to throw them out because they couldn't sing. This was old Avalon Hall. It was the former home of David Lipscomb. It is next to the Granny White Church of Christ building. Quite a contrast. Now we'll change again just quickly as time comes to a close. This is about preachers. Lipscomb was concerned about the effects of wealth on work and the aspirations of preachers. He said their central work should be among the poor and the common people, but large salaries turn their heads in another direction. To pay large salaries is to excite the thirst for wealth and corrupt the simplicity of the life of the preacher. And this unfits him for successful work among the common people. Furthermore, he says, such salaries put a gag in the preacher's mouth. The preacher will cater to his supporters. And hence we universally find that the sins of the rich are glossed over and apologized for, while the lesser sins of the poor are exaggerated and condemned. And especially is this so in fashionable and wealthy churches and communities. A lot of our preachers today wouldn't have liked David Lipscomb. He wanted the preachers to be poor. And if there's any one thing of the teaching of Lipscomb that has carried down through the church for the years, that's probably the teaching. Things have really gotten better in recent years. And most congregations today do a fairly good job of paying preachers and helping them do their work. Lipscomb charged that the whole plan of a preacher's putting himself up to the highest bidder and shifting about from place to place for the sake of a little higher salary is at once a degradation to Christianity. He said, preach to the poor, the neglected and the degraded, and if you live poor, you will be one of the world's true heroes and heaven's crowned victors. He said that the crowning characteristic of the Christian religion is the esteem of its founder, is that the poor have the gospel preached to them. And the church that failed to make this its most important work, Lipscomb was convinced, could scarcely claim to be a true Church of Christ. Here's where we started with this statement that Lipscomb made. The poor of this world were the chosen vessels of mercy, especially honored and blessed of God, and they as a class constitute His elect. We need to be sure that we don't forget Jesus, His ministry, who He reached out to, what He did, and we have the same responsibility today if we're the followers of Jesus. I hope this has been helpful for you. Next week we're going to talk about faithful shepherds. If you don't recognize this, we're going to talk about elders and bishops also. Anybody have a final comment that you'd like to share?
I was just thinking about the buildings. There's nothing wrong with having a nice building.
No.
And I think, I've never been into a Church of Christ anywhere that I've ever been that was as opulent as the Catholic churches in Mexico that were overlaid with gold, and the people were so poor. The people lived in like almost cardboard boxes.
Yeah.
Pathetic. Really, really sad.
I don't think it's as big a problem with most churches of Christ. Sometimes you forget where you've come from. Sometimes you forget what you're doing. But I think that just kind of is an up and down as far as the progress of the character of the church. And it changes from time to time. Every time there's a change in the eldership, there's a change in the characteristic of the congregation. Every time that there are new members that are added, there's a change in the characteristic of the Christian community that meets in that particular place.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, ma'am.
When he started National Bible College in 1891, what was his goal? Was it to train people to go teach the poor? Did he encourage the poor to come there for Bible study, to learn more? Do you know what his intentions were when he started it?
His basic intention was just to teach the Bible.
To poor people, or to just...
To anyone.
Or to whoever could afford to come?
Sort of the latter. My grandmother attended there. It was, at that time, was only a 2-year school. And when she left there, she was evidently qualified to teach music in public school because that's what she did. I really don't know an awful lot about the school. He was responsible for helping train young men to preach too. That was part of what the school was about. There weren't an awful lot of co-ed schools back in those days. There were schools for men and schools for women, and maybe some of the public universities were co-ed. But as far as a small school, oftentimes they were not. Now, the Baptists have always had a school just down the road from Lipscomb Belmont College. And in recent years, both Lipscomb and Belmont have just expanded tremendously, and both of them are not known as little schools anymore.
The Nashville Bible School as much as it does today.
Yeah.
And I don't see him in the beginning as being the one who would seek a lot of wealth.
Not him. Part of the problem of the great expense of education today is that in most schools they have centered upon making sure that all of their professors have their doctor's degree, and that demands more money, and that's why the cost of, I mean, if you got a building that's been there for 60 years, like several of the buildings on the campus down there, how much cost is there in that for Robert, you probably remember too how much we thought that the living on the campus was very expensive. It was almost as expensive as the education was. But of course, some ate more than others, so that probably made the difference too. Thank you for being very kind tonight, and I'm glad I didn't have to use the prize bar very often to get some comments out of you. Next week we'll talk about God's shepherds.